Fredrik Axel von Fersen, known to history as Axel von Fersen the Elder, to distinguish him from his more famous son of the same name, was born in Stockholm on April 5th, 1719, just a few weeks after the crowning of Queen Ulrika Eleonora. He was born into a new era and would spend most of his life both serving and leading parliamentary rule, until in the last decade of his life, when he would fight one final, fruitless struggle against the returning absolute monarchy. Von Fersen spent his youth studying at Uppsala and Lund universities and in Stockholm, before he in 1739 was sent abroad to Germany for further studies. Von Fersen spent the next year traveling in Germany, France and England. In the spring of 1740, he became a captain at the raised German regiment d'Alsace in the French army. Here he soon became involved in the Austrian War of Succession and was part of the campaign of 1741 that ended with Maurice of Saxony's legendary bayonets-only storming of Prague. In December of that year, word reached von Fersen that he was being recalled home. The Hats, who had gotten majority power in parliament 3 years earlier, had taken the country to war with Russia. But when von Fersen in March 1742 reached Finland, the war had already seen its decisive action 7 months earlier. In cooperation with France, the Hats had helped plan and support the future Empress Elizabeth's coming coup in Russia. The plan for the war had been for the Swedish army to march towards St. Petersburg to put pressure on the Russian government. Elizabeth would then execute her coup, after which she had promised to sign a peace favorable for Sweden. In theory, it was at least a plan, but the Hats had forgotten one important detail when it came to warfare. They hadn't prepared the army. The army leadership at the time was full of commanders who had extensive experience as mid-level officers from all the major campaigns of the Great Northern War. But the line-level army itself was neither well-supplied nor well-trained, and while the generals had experience, they also came from different political parties and did not cooperate effectively. Major General Karl-Henrik Wrangel, who was a member of the Kaps party and who had opposed the war, had been ordered to take a forward position at Wilmanstrand. Wrangel had fought in several of the big battles in the Great Northern War, including Poltava, where he was captured. He had spent the rest of that war in Russian captivity and wasn't released until 1721. Now his superior was Henrik Magnus von Buddenbrook, who was a member of the ruling Hats party and a heavy proponent for the war. He had also ordered Wrangel to avoid fighting the Russians directly. But when Wrangel arrived in Wilmanstrand, he realized the Russian army more than twice his own was heading towards him, and because of bad communications between the two political opponents, von Buddenbrook had now not reached him in time. The Battle of Wilmanstrand could only end with a Russian victory. When the Russians realized the opposing corps was not the entire Swedish army, they lined up and charged. These first attacks were repulsed, but after a while, part of the Swedish army broke. Some regiments, like Västerbotten's regiment, remained fighting though, and their motto to this day is, "They never retreated, or for their own sake lost." Wrangel himself was injured in the fighting, had to have his arm amputated, and was later captured. Wrangel's corps had now effectively ceased to exist, and the war von Fersen arrived at the following year would only be defensive. We should note here that one of the regiments that was hardest hit in this battle was the Dalarna regiment, a detail that will become important later in our story. In December, the now Empress Elizabeth successfully carried out her coup, but this did not end the war. Some sources say Elizabeth refused to honor her promise to end the war. Others say the Hats party leaders rejected her offer thinking it was not good enough. Regardless, when von Fersen arrived, he successfully led the defense of a position at Pyttis in a small-scale engagement, and then did not see any significant fighting for the rest of 1742. Leeuwenhoek tried to regain the initiative in the war. As the overall commander of forces in Finland, he saw himself as in charge of both the army and the naval forces. The navy initially had supremacy in the Gulf of Finland, and his plan was for the two services to do a joint offensive. But the naval commanders refused to obey Leeuwenhoek's orders, and most attempts at cooperation between the two branches broke down. After a while, the army was forced to retreat west, first to Borgå, and then finally to Helsingfors. A retreat that was yet again made more difficult by a failure of cooperation between the army and the navy. On August 19, 1742, both Leeuwenhoek and Buddenbrook were recalled to Stockholm, and the next day the army and parts of the Swedish galley fleet were completely surrounded in Helsingfors. On August 24th, the acting commander of the Swedish forces chose to surrender, in exchange for the Swedish part of the army being able to return to Sweden and the Finnish part being dismissed. The next month, the navy also withdrew the fleet back to Sweden. The war had been a disaster, and it would still go on for almost another year, but lessons were learned. We will now quickly take a look at two things that largely came out of the experiences from this conflict, and which will later have an impact on our story. The Swedish command and the Hats party realized Sweden needed a strong point in Finland to which the army and the navy could retreat to await reinforcement and then go back on the offensive. The army also needed to be more effective at fighting in the archipelagos of the Baltic Sea. It was therefore assigned to the genius young officer Augustin Ehrensvärd to build a fortress in Finland. Ehrensvärd selected a group of islands outside of Helsingfors, on which he built several interlinked forts, and in the middle of these, a naval base. The fortress was named Sveaborg and became his life's work. It would eventually become the strongest in Sweden, and possibly even among the strongest in Europe at the time. In 1808, at the end of its Swedish service, it held over 2,000 different pieces of artillery inside its walls and in its storage rooms. Its heaviest trial would come in 1855, when it withstood a 48-hour-long bombardment from about 80 French and British warships during the Crimean War. In addition to Sveaborg, Ehrensvärd initiated construction of a second fortification, called Svartholms Fortress, closer to the new border with Russia. Much of the construction of this fortress would be overseen by Fabian Wrede, whose son of the same name will be an important person in Sweden in late Napoleonic times. He will be one of 9 characters featured in this series. Ehrensvärd also had an idea for what would become the Archipelago Fleet, also called the Army's Navy. These naval squadrons would be equipped with newly designed smaller and shallow-going ships and boats that could operate in coastal waters where the high seas fleet could not. As its name suggests, the Archipelago Fleet were under the command of the army and not the navy, and would fight a sort of amphibious warfare. During late 1742, the Russian army had occupied much of Finland and sent an invasion force to the Åland Islands. In response, Colonel Gotthard Wilhelm Marx von Württemberg, who was a member of the Caps party, was ordered to assemble a force of 1,000 men and retake the islands. In 1741, Marx von Württemberg had been sent to Finland by the king to review the status of the army. But according to von Fersen's version of events, the colonel had instead used the opportunity to incite the soldiers against Levenhaupt's leadership. Though this claim should be considered with the context that von Fersen's father was a leading Hat politician, and he himself would eventually become the leader of the party. Regardless of its veracity, von Fersen now volunteered to go on the expedition to the Åland Islands. The expedition was successful, and the islands were retaken, with the Russian soldiers taken prisoners and their ships captured. In February 1743, von Fersen was named a corporal at the prestigious Brabant Corps, and in May he was called to serve the king in Stockholm. Now, with the war going on in Finland, this might sound like a safer and more peaceful position. But there was just a tiny little bit of an issue with that. Do you remember the Dalarna regiment that was particularly hit hard at the Battle of Wilmanstrand? Well, their compatriots in Dalarna were now slightly pissed off about the war and how the Hats had been governing the country. The peasants had gone into uprising mode and gotten help from local officers, through which they procured arms from the army's local storage. Meaning, an army of maybe as many as 3,000 to 4,000 armed peasants were now marching against Stockholm, in what would become called the Great Dalecarlian Dance. It is also called the Fourth Dalecarlian Rebellion, because the province had some historical experience in these things. This meant that it had now become a little bit of an issue that the army was not in Stockholm at the moment. According to von Fersen's account of events, which has been questioned by historians, King Frederick decided to ride out and meet the rebellious mob before it reached the capital. Von Fersen rode with the king, and when they got closer to the rebels, he was ordered to ride up ahead and inform the leaders of the peasants that the king was here and wanted to talk to them. When von Fersen arrived at the head of the army, he ordered them to halt and informed the leader named Gustav Sjödin that the king was here. Together, Fersen and Sjödin then rode to meet the king. King Frederick explained he wanted to inspect the peasants' army, which they agreed to, and the army stood aside and let the king ride up and down the line. When he returned from the inspection, Frederick explained to the leaders that a deal for peace had been made and that the Russians had promised to leave most of Finland. The king then asked that they send a delegation into Stockholm, which he could discuss their concerns with, but that the rest of the army remain outside the city. The peasant leaders promised to do this, and the king returned to the capital with von Fersen. But when the king had left, the peasants convinced themselves that they were being fooled, and soon the march was back on. At Norrtull, the northern entrance to Stockholm, the peasants were met by a small army detachment, led by the old Karelian officer Karl Otto Lagerkrantz. True to his old training in the Karelian doctrine, Lagerkrantz wanted to attack the much larger peasant force, but the king was clear in ordering him that no force was to be used. That meant that when the two forces met, the peasants could just walk past the army post and then into Stockholm, where they made camp at the square Gustav Adolfs Torg. It was now just the small river Norrström and the royal guard that separated them from Stockholm Palace. The situation went into a sort of stalemate, with neither side either unable or unwilling to take the initiative. It is clear the peasants wanted to see changes in how the country was run, and they wanted a say about who would become crown prince, with the king now both old and a widower. But it wasn't clear. The majority wanted to overthrow the government. This went on for 2 days of negotiations, before enough army forces had been gathered for the military to be able to challenge the peasants. A war of words soon escalated into shots being fired, and 2 of the regiments were ordered to open fire on the peasants, but both refused, not wanting to hurt their countrymen. But when Älvsborg's regiment, commanded by Lagerkrantz, became involved, he ordered them to open fire, which they did, and this salvo scattered the peasants' forces. The following street battle was a one-way affair, and somewhere between 40 and 150 peasants were killed, while hundreds more were injured. With that, the rebellion was stopped, and its leaders were later executed. But they would not be the only ones to be executed in the aftermath of this disastrous war. The Hats Party realized they needed to contain the political fallout from the war if they wanted to stay in power. One way to do that was to shift blame to the army commanders Levenhaupt and Buddenbrock. Both were sentenced to death and beheaded. The peace treaty with Russia was signed in August, and Sweden gave up territory east of Kymene River, and also agreed to have Empress Elizabeth's favorite, the Prince Bishop of Lübeck, Adolf Fredrik, named Swedish Crown Prince. With that, von Fersen took his leave from Sweden for his second European tour, which we will talk about in the next episode of this series.